Hi, I'm Paul Feiner, and today we have a really interesting program. History tends to repeat itself, and my guest is Helen Rubel, and Helen's grandmother and mother were Holocaust survivors.
Right.
And we want to make sure that people never forget the tragedies of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, many Holocaust survivors are no longer with us, and it's important that history be remembered. So Helen, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your thoughts about, the Holocaust.
Okay, well, I'm a 35-year, maybe plus, resident of Greenburgh, believe it or not, and a member of the HHREC, the Westchester HHREC, which is the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. And I presented a number of times about my family history. I'm a social worker, and I have 2 grown children and 2 grandchildren, and my husband and I have been married 50 plus years, and I was married at 8. And that's a little bit about me, and I'm a cancer survivor. So far, so good.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about both your grandmother and your mother and their stories?
Yes. My mother grew up in a small town in Germany, Hadamar, which is in Western Germany in the vicinity of Frankfurt. My grandmother also grew up in that same area. And they had a prosperous business in Germany. And unfortunately, in the 30s, when Hitler started coming to power, they said, this guy's a nut. He's never going to amount to anything. He'll come and go. They were optimistic, which wasn't the case. Now, my mother's biological father had died before she was born as a soldier in World War I. And my grandmother remarried. My mother thought of this father as her biological father. It was the only father she ever knew. I mean, that was her father, so I will refer to him as her father. However, it's relevant that my mother's bio father, my grandmother's first husband, died in World War I. My mother thought that as an orphan, that her father had died, she would be protected on some level as a Jew. But in fact, it didn't matter. What Hitler did is my bio grandfather's name was on a monument in the town hall. Well, he erased it. So that was the level of hatred and antagonism.
And they were Jewish.
Yeah. They were Jewish, though. Yeah.
So were they sent to concentration camps?
What happened was in November 1938, was Kristallnacht. And on Kristallnacht, my grandmother and grandfather were given a tip that this was going to happen. So they fled to the border of Holland and Germany, and they waited until they could get in, smuggled in, much as people today smuggle them in from the border. And my mother's youngest sister was ill. She was recovering from an appendix surgery. So my mother stayed with her.
Right. So they were able to avoid the concentration camps, your family?
Well, my mother, not all of them. So during Kristallnacht, when the Germans destroyed the synagogues and German houses, and it was a nationwide pogrom, right? My mother and sister hid at a seminary of Catholic brothers with other townspeople. And then when they came back to the house, everything was a mess. So they cleaned everything up, And then they went to Holland.
Right.
So what happened is my mother's eldest sister and husband, who were married and living in Amsterdam, my mother, her youngest sister, my grandparents, all were in Holland. And they hid from the Germans. They were in numerous hiding places. Eventually, they were pinned down. And my mother and grandmother were able to escape where they were imprisoned. My grandmother was in a hospital that they were, for elderly, that they were planning to unload onto a train. And my grandmother got on her hands and knees and begged to be let out. My mother was imprisoned in a holding area in Amsterdam, and she managed to escape.
How did she escape?
What happened was she was a nurse, so she was given a job of taking care of the children who were separated from their parents, who were being held in this facility. And my mother decided she would get up early and try to walk out as if she was a change of shift, like the Nazis who were guarding. And the first day she wanted to do it, she overslept. And then the next day she got up on time and she walked out. And my grandmother and mother met at the home of someone in the Dutch underground.
So when she walked out and escaped, then did she know where she was going to go, or was there an underground where they told you to go to this building?
They had some kind of smuggling of information between them. So my grandmother and mother met at the home of these people, the Knobbers, in Amsterdam, who agreed to hide them. Now my mother's sister, the youngest sister, was told to turn herself in. And there's a recent movie called Occupied City, in which they show where people had to turn themselves in. My mother would not turn herself in, but because she also felt she was protected because her father was a war hero. But her sister didn't have her sister's biological father was the stepfather. But my mother begged her sister, "Don't turn yourself in," but she did. And then
and when she turned herself in, what happened?
What happened was they put them in a facility called Westerbork, which was a holding facility outside of Amsterdam, and then they shipped them all out on a train to Auschwitz. And my mother's...
And did she survive?
No. My mother's eldest sister and her husband were also picked up and sent to Auschwitz. And in fact, in the material I gave you, there's a copy of the letter from the Red Cross that says, where my aunt died. My grandmother received letters from the Red Cross about her husband and her two daughters, stating that they were murdered in Auschwitz in such and such a year, because the Germans did keep records and the Red Cross obtained them. Now my grandfather, the man I will refer to as my grandfather, he was picked up and sent to Westerbork, the holding facility, and he basically survived the war in work camps. But in the very end, the poor man was marched from the work camp outward because the Nazis wanted to hide their despicable acts, and he died in the march.
Oh, that's terrible.
So the very end, which was tragic for my grandmother, just tragic. She lost her two daughters and her husband, and it was tragic. Fortunately, she had my mother. Now, the two of them were hidden in the attic of these wonderful people, the Knobbers, and were able to survive.
So it's sort of like when people read about Anne Frank, where they were being hid in safe homes.
Right.
That's basically the experiences your mother had.
Yes. But I guess one difference is that Anna Frank's family hid early, and my mother's family was on the run. They went from home to home to home, and there were 3 occasions where they hid when the Nazis went into their apartment and they were not found.
How did they hide?
One time they hid in a closet behind bags of coal, and another time they hid in a closet behind I think behind a couch or a sofa, and they weren't found.
And they
were very
hidden
lucky.
Areas where there could be like a closet. It could be
These
like
were
a
in
photo,
closets.
and then they open a door.
Interesting. I don't know, but when the 2 times the family hid from the Nazis, it was a whole Jewish section that they were invading, so to speak. So there were a lot of Jewish people who didn't hide. So maybe what happened was, with all the people that didn't hide, they overlooked my parents, my grandmother and mother, and her father and sister, because they were, they had enough. Maybe they had enough people.
So that's so interesting. Did members of your family after the war stay in touch with some of the people who helped save them? Yeah.
Well, when they hid in the Knobbers' home in Amsterdam, they were in the attic, and Mr. Knob, attic of that house, that was just my mother and grandmother. But Mr. Knobber built a bunch of hiding places, like a false wall, a false door,
right,
so that they wouldn't be found. So after the war, there's a organization called Yad Vashem that recognizes all the quote-unquote righteous Gentiles that help Jews. And before my mother died in 1990, it was very important for her to recognize the Knobbers. And so she sent a testimony to Yad Vashem. And in fact, sadly, it was after my mother died that there was a ceremony in Amsterdam where the daughters of the people, the parents, were given an award, and their names are in Yad Vashem as.
But they never stayed in touch with them while they never connected with the families after the war was over.
Oh, they did.
Oh, really?
They did. Oh, yeah. No, the Knobbers' son or grandson was an architect in Suriname, and I remember him visiting. So they were in regular contact with the Knobbers by letter.
Do you stay in touch with the family?
Sadly, I don't have a contact, although I'm sure I could locate them.
Yeah, one of the thoughts.
I mean, they were. My mother spoke so highly of the family, and in fact, the children, who received the award, the daughter of the Knobbers, they couldn't bring any friends to the house. I mean, they had to be during that period, because they could be ratted out.
When your mother was staying with the Knobbers, did she? I always was curious. Was somebody staying in like a safe house or whatever? Did they go outside during the day?
No.
So they were not able to like escape for a couple hours and then go back. They were just stuck in the room.
They went downstairs during the day.
They weren't out to leave.
No, they couldn't, because in fact the Knobbers had a son who was executed by the Nazis for being in the resistance. So if my mother and grandmother had been found, the whole family would have been shot, probably.
You mean the Knobbers family and your family?
Oh yeah. In fact, when my grandfather went in the holding facility, Westerbork, he could have walked out, possibly, but the Nazis were so evil that if one person left, they would shoot 10 who were there. So it was really the pressure was great.
This is like so fascinating. I'm so glad that you had contacted me. The question that I have is, we're living in difficult times now in the United States, and everybody thinks it can happen here in the United States. But there's a rise in anti-Semitism, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because you mentioned your parents thought that Hitler was a nutcase and nobody would take him seriously, but he did get elected by the people.
That's right, and he stayed elected.
And he stayed elected.
Oh, yeah.
So do you sort of feel the similarities in the United States? Do you like, if I say, I'm really worried that the Holocaust could happen here, do you think that I'm like exaggerating, or do you think it really could happen here?
It's very, we're headed in a direction where there's a lot of enmity between groups. And I think it could happen, yeah. It's scary to me when I think of the fact, I recently discovered a paper that listed my biological grandfather's army history. And, you think, oh, well, he fought for Germany. How could you ever say, how could you erase that? Doesn't that mean anything? It doesn't mean anything. At the end of the day, it didn't mean anything. That could happen again. That could happen here.
And they were.
I agree with you, but it's very, very nuanced. This whole problem we have now is more new. It's like a Rubik's cube with Israel and Palestine. People are dying in Palestine, and it's terrible. I deplore it. But can you negotiate with someone who wants to wipe you out? These are serious questions. I don't have the answer. But I think these kinds of dilemmas can lead to people wanting to see things as black and white because it's so easy.
Right. And your family, they were successful in Germany.
They were middle class. And don't forget, Germany, the Jews in Germany were very, very integrated into the town. After my mother left and my grandmother, they had contact with people that they were friends with. So, not everybody was a Nazi.
So what was your what businesses were they in?
My grandmother's family, my mother's family, was in the leather business. They sold shoes, they sold wholesale leather. I should also mention my father also came from Germany. He came in 1937, was very lucky. He joined his family here. And they brought them all over. But my father's family was in the cattle dealing business. Now, cattle dealers were very common in Germany as a profession. And when he came to the United States, after working, he first worked at the St. George Hotel as a porter, and then he had a job at Diamond Jim Brady's in Times Square as a bartender. And then he met my mother, and they moved to Connecticut, where there were many German Jewish cattle dealers. So that was what the business my father had. And I grew up in Connecticut, but he commuted to a farm in the area of Litchfield, that northwestern Connecticut. And that was not uncommon. My mother was trained as a nurse in Frankfurt, and that's what she did, part-time. And
I've always noticed that when I was growing up, I noticed that children of the Holocaust are very, very successful. Many of them are very, very successful. When I see somebody and they're like brilliant, I say to myself, if they're Jewish, I bet you they're a child of the Holocaust, and usually I'm right. And I'm wondering why it is that children of Holocaust survivors
No, that's
excel. I mean, I don't. I'm pretty sure I'm not exaggerating because.
That's very kind.
But it's really.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I grew up in a home where my grandmother, was very openly mourning her lost life, her family, and my mother wasn't like that. She was, when every day she did her business and she was positive. My father didn't talk about what he had gone through. I'm sure he went through something because the cattle dealing business was affected by the Nazis. The Nazis put pressure on their customers. Anyway, I think that a consciousness from having parents who went through and a lot. And I think that in general, first generation, whether they're Spanish or Jamaican, have dealing with parents who have had to make major changes in their lives and also deal with different cultures. So I think that gives one a certain soul, a certain intellect, a certain drive,
Right.
that maybe that other people who grow up more comfortably may not have. I mean, I was remembering the other day that in my house we had one kind of cereal. That was, we didn't have 10 choices. And I remember visiting friends and they had like 6 different kinds of cereal. Well, my parents lived with little. So, I was brought up to treasure every little thing I had.
Wow.
Not to take it for granted. Because in 1944, when my mother and grandmother were hidden, there was a great starvation in Amsterdam. And people died of starvation. They were eating tulip bulbs, So that's the sensibility I grew up with, not the plushness of our culture.
Yeah, one of the issues that keeps coming up is, as time goes on, people forget about the Holocaust. So for people who, are in school right now, it seems like ancient history. Are you worried that more and more people will become Holocaust deniers? Because I think that's becoming a problem in the United States as people are not, it's far away that some people are just denying.
I remember doing some research when I was writing about my family's experience and coming across a Holocaust denial website, and it just blew me away. It was shocking. And I keep remembering the phrase, people who forget history are bound to repeat it, and I look at what's happening, and that seems to be where we're at.
Yeah.
With when I look at what happens in Russia with Putin and the Ukraine, the fact is that people want to say, oh, so let him have it. Well, that's what happened with Hitler in the Sudetenland. It's scary. It's very scary. To see this and to see, when I lecture to kids, I talk about being an upstander. And if you see someone being beaten up or teased or whatever, to stand up for that person. Don't fade, to be strong.
That's true. So
I'm going to interrupt. So I think the importance of remembering the Holocaust is to use it as a way to encourage people to be human, to be humane, to do the right thing, to stand up to stand against discrimination.
And you speak all over about
I'm recovering from an illness. So during the past I just started doing a speech. But that's the importance of it. It's not, I mean, it's important to remember it in and of itself, but to use it to create a better world.
That is, that is true. And it's very, very scary because history tends to repeat itself. And, when I look at the elections that we're facing, and the rise in anti-Semitism, I'm really surprised because I, never would have thought that here in the United States, people who are Jewish, like myself, would have to worry about anti-Semitism. When I was growing up,
Right.
I never even thought about it.
No, me neither.
I thought it could never happen. And again, in Germany, when your mother and grandmother were there, the sun shone, and they had businesses, and they interacted with other people. They probably had German friends.
Oh yeah,
and
they were very the Jews of Germany were very integrated. They weren't, or at least my family was by and large. They weren't. They weren't in a little
it's
village.
like the same thing like here.
Like here.
Yeah, we're running out of time. Could you just mention again the names of your parent?
My grandmother is Rosal Kahn Neuhaus. Her first husband was Kahn. Her second was Neuhaus. My mother was Laura, or Lori Rubel, was her married name, and her maiden name was Kahn, K-A-H-N. My father was Alfred Rubel.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and this was so interesting, and I'm hopeful that our listeners will never forget, because history repeats itself. And
sadly.
And this was really great. We have had other interviews with survivors, and during Yom HaShoah every year we'll replay this tape, and I think it's important for other survivors to tell their family stories as well.
I agree. Thank you.
And
thank you for the opportunity.
Great. And I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor.